Thank you, Chair Sanders. I'm about to speak as a ranking member, of course representing Republicans, but also trying to represent the kind of concern regarding committee process and my responsibility as a ranking member to make sure that it's completed. With that said, for almost a decade and a half, this committee has worked past partisanship to produce meaningful legislation. And we, on both sides, have set apart 20% of where we disagreed to focus on the 80% where we agreed. But this means that for every markup, there is an agreement between the chair and ranking member for that which is considered. And nobody got everything they wanted all the time, but we got key legislative victories, and in so doing, the Help Committee made lasting change. I will point out, this markup is different. This is the committee's first partisan markup since the Affordable Care Act in 2009. And abandoning a bipartisan approach, which has defined our committee and has made it so productive at addressing issues facing our fellow Americans, means that this legislation will not pass. And I'm saying that with no sense of victory. I'm just saying that it takes 60 votes to pass in the Senate. And whatever we produce will not get those 60 votes. And why? Because this is a deeply controversial and partisan set of bills that, again, will never be signed into law. Now, I'm the ranking member. We are all supposed to be concerned about the committee fulfilling its responsibilities. But we have 2 legislative days left before the July recess, and we don't have agreements in principle, nor agreements on key issues, or draft text for many important bipartisan programs that can matter a heck of a lot to both the Democrat and Republican members of this committee, and these programs are expiring in September. For example, we don't have an agreement on text for the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act reauthorization, which supports our nation's response to global pandemics. Negotiations are being held up because of drug policy demands that are completely outside the purview of PAPA. We don't have an agreed upon process for addressing the Support Act, which addresses our nation's opioid crisis. We don't have text or even basic agreement on funding levels for the reauthorization of community health centers or the National Health Center Service Corps to help troubling shortages in our nation's healthcare workforce. The chair had announced to Politico a few weeks ago that he's requesting roughly $131 billion for community health centers over 5 years. Current funding is $20 billion over 5. We don't have offsets. CBO has not scored this. If we're going to find offsets, we should have been working on this since January. But that said, all the staff time that has gone into this partisan markup is not being used for that. And the likelihood of successfully vetting and operationalizing policies to justify or pay for an over 5 times increase in funding, in addition to finding agreements on other reauthorizations that I mentioned, in the 16 days between now and what should be our deadline, which is the beginning of August recess, is, shall I say, slim. Instead, we're having a partisan hearing on labor bills, which will never be signed into law. Now, it's the majority's right to hold partisan hearings and markups that have a 0 chance of advancing beyond the markup. That's their prerogative, but it should not be at the expense of the bipartisan work that we're responsible to complete. By the way, there's other bipartisan things we could be working on. Expanding Pell Grants for short-term programs of at least 8 weeks. Reauthorizing the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act to modernize and improve federal workforce programs. Fulfilling our constitutional duty to advise and consent President Biden on his nominations to fill vacancies at agencies like the NIH. Now, I hate to be disagreeable. I am so willing to work with the chair or anyone in the majority on programs, on policies, on laws that can get 60 votes in the Senate, to have a signing ceremony once the law is passed. But these bills are not they. One piece of legislation under consideration today is the Protecting the Right to Organize, or the PRO Act. It's not pro-worker, it's just pro-big union. And being pro-worker means defending the rights of all workers, including those who don't want to join a union. This PRO Act eliminates secret ballot elections, which is the gold standard to keep somebody from being put into a corner and intimidated until they vote the way the intimidator wishes them to vote. Secret ballot elections for unionization also protects workers from retaliation if they choose a different way. The PRO Act eliminates right to work in my home state and 25 other states, forcing workers, even if they don't want to unionize. By the way, if somebody wants to unionize, more power to them. I support their right to choose what's best for their career. But if the benefits of being in a union are so self-evident, there's no reason that workers have to be coerced and strong-armed to join. And they don't need the government to help coerce and strong-arm them. I will say this legislation is part of a disturbing trend by President Biden and congressional Democrats to erode a worker's individual rights. That is why I and the other Republican members of this committee introduced the Employees' Rights Act with our colleagues, Senators Tim Scott, Mitch McConnell, and John Thune. The Employer Rights Act upholds the rights of workers to choose what's best for their career, whether to join a union or not. It also protects the right to secret ballot elections, among other things. I join all colleagues to join in supporting this common sense legislation, protecting the rights of all Americans. This legislation is truly pro-worker. I repeat, the bills being offered today have no chance of becoming law. We have decided, this committee, the chair, has decided to prioritize the 20% of things we disagree on over the 80% of things where we do agree. We have real responsibilities that Americans are depending upon us to complete, and this committee should rise to this occasion. In closing, I'll say I'm sorry that my remarks are so disagreeable, but we got 16 legislative days left before the August recess. We reasonably have to complete these authorizations by then for them to be included in an end-of-the-year fiscal package, and we've not agreed upon basic frameworks and funding amounts. My hope is that the time lost preparing for this markup will be compensated for by greater productivity in the next 16 legislative days. I yield, and thank you.